Elias Marchetti never imagined the day would come when he would find Maren Ashford lying unconscious in the snow, in the alley behind an all-night diner, wearing a frayed waitress uniform and 7 months pregnant. It was still dark, Chicago cold enough to cut through a man, and the headlights of his black car swept across the falling snow and stopped on a figure curled beside the trash bins, her back already gone white beneath it. He stepped out, his leather shoes grinding into the ice, knelt on one knee, and turned the woman over. And then his whole world went still. The face beneath that snow was the face he had spent 9 winters trying to erase. Her lips were blue, her hair matted to her cheek, her hands cracked and bleeding from bleach and cold. Maren opened her eyes. For a moment her gaze was clouded, recognizing nothing. Then it found his, and Elias watched the terror rise in it. But the first thing she did was not to cry for help, and not to run. Trembling, she lifted both hands and pulled her thin coat closed over her belly, as though the thing she feared losing most in this world was not her own life. "I have to get back to work," she whispered, pushing herself up on one arm. "Lie still." Elias put a hand on her shoulder, and his voice broke on the last word. 9 winters ago, this woman had stood among 200 guests in the ballroom of the Ashford Grand and said she didn't know anyone who worked as a waiter. 9 winters later, she lay at his feet in the snow with nothing left in the world but a torn uniform. But what set his heart pounding in that moment was not victory. It was a question that ran cold down his spine, one he could not yet put a name to. Why was the only daughter of the Ashford Empire working the night shift at the far edge of this city? And why, in the weakest moment of her life, did she look at him with fear instead of shame? If you want to know the truth behind that look, leave a like, drop a comment, share this story, and subscribe to our channel to walk the whole road with Elias and Maren. The ambulance rolled out of the alley, its red lights sweeping in broken circles across the brick walls, and Elias Marchetti sat behind the wheel of his black car, following it through streets that were still asleep. The snow was falling so heavily that the windshield wipers could barely breathe. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't call anyone. He only watched the blinking red light ahead and gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Mercy General Hospital appeared at the end of the avenue like a silent block of light in the middle of the storm, and when the rear doors of the ambulance opened, he was already standing there, snow gathering on the shoulders of his black wool coat, without saying a word. They wheeled her through the double doors. He followed as far as the yellow line painted on the floor, then stopped, because this was the one place in the city where his power meant nothing. He stood there for a very long time. A tall, broad-shouldered man with closely cropped black hair, standing in the emergency room corridor before dawn among homeless people dozing in their seats, and a young mother rocking her feverish child, and not one of them knew that all this man had to do was pick up the phone, and half the construction projects underway in Chicago would come to a halt the next morning. Hank Delaney arrived not long afterward. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply looked Elias over once, nodded, then quietly walked to the far end of the corridor and took his place there, his hands clasped in front of his stomach, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the door. From that moment on, no one entered that part of the hospital without passing Hank. Dr. Ruth Halloran came out when the sky beyond the windows had faded from black to the color of dull pewter. She was about 50, her hair tied back in haste, the sleeves of her white coat pushed up, and she held the test results as though they were something that had left her weary. "Are you family?" she asked. "I'm the one who found her." She studied him for another moment, then decided that was enough. "She's severely anemic. Her iron level was so low that I had the test repeated because I thought the machine was broken. She's been suffering from malnutrition for a long time. Not for a few weeks, but for months. Her body temperature had dropped, and the baby is far below the expected weight at 30 weeks. She turned to the next page. I asked her how many hours she works each day. Do you want to hear her answer? Elias said nothing. 16, she said. A night shift at a diner, followed by a morning shift at a laundry. She sleeps on the train between shifts. She told me that as if she were reading from a grocery list. A silence followed. Then Elias turned his face away and looked through the window at the end of the corridor, where the snow was still falling sideways through the glow of the streetlights. He remained silent for so long that Dr. Halloran thought he had left. How long before she can be discharged? He asked, his voice perfectly calm. Not soon. And once she is discharged, she can't go back to working like that. If she does, I can't promise you anything about the baby. He nodded once. The hospital director appeared less than 15 minutes later, snow still clinging to the shoulders of his coat, his tie knotted in haste. No one had called him. He simply knew. "Mr. Marchetti," he said, and in those two words was something Dr. Halloran recognized at once, something that made her look up from the file. "I just heard. I'm very sorry." Elias looked at him. "She needs a private room, a quiet floor. No one goes in except the team on duty." The director didn't ask who the patient was. He didn't ask who would pay or why. He took out his pen, signed the paper a nurse handed him, then signed another and returned the file with both hands. "It'll be done within 20 minutes. Dr. Halloran watched him disappear around the corner, then looked at the man in the black coat and asked no more questions. Maren woke as they were moving her onto the 7th floor. The room was quiet. The window looked out over a forest of snow-covered rooftops, and an intravenous line ran into her hand. It took her a moment to understand where she was. Then she saw him sitting in the chair by the door, his elbows resting on his knees, and she tried to sit up so quickly that the heart monitor gave a sharp cry. "Don't tell them." Those were the first words she spoke. She didn't thank him. She didn't ask whether her baby was all right. "Don't tell the diner and don't tell the laundry, please. If they find out I'm in the hospital, they'll put someone else in my place before the week is over. I can go back to work. I only need one shift off." Her voice broke on the final word. Elias watched her for a long time. For 9 winters, he had imagined this moment in 100 different ways, and in none of them was there a woman lying in a hospital bed, begging him not to take away her job waiting tables. "The hospital bill has been paid," he said. "You'll stay here until the doctor says you can leave." She shook her head as tears began to run down her temples. "I can't afford it. You don't understand. I have nothing I can give you in return. I'm not doing this for you." He stood and turned up the collar of his coat. "Go to sleep." Then he walked out and closed the door very gently behind him. He didn't leave right away. He stood outside in the dim stretch of corridor beyond the window and watched her through the glass until her breathing slowed and the hand clutching the edge of the blanket finally let go. A few steps away, Hank remained motionless as a brick wall. Outside, morning had fully arrived, bringing a milky white light with no sun in it. Elias reached down and turned the cracked steel watch on his wrist, turning it back and forth, slowly, like a man trying to remember something he hadn't allowed himself to remember for 9 winters. There are things a man believes he has buried until he stands in a hospital corridor at daybreak and realizes they were never still beneath the ground. And as the elevator carried him down to the parking garage, 9 winters earlier came rushing back in its entirety, as though not a single day had passed. He had been 25 then, working the evening shift behind the bar of a small hotel 6 blocks away, and he had spent that entire afternoon begging the manager to let him leave early, but the man had refused. He ran all the way from the train station to the avenue, his tie hastily stuffed into his pants pocket, his hands still carrying the scent of lemon peel and the cold of crushed ice, a faintly sweet and sour smell that clung to his skin and that no amount of soap in the public restroom could wash away. Inside the inner pocket of his coat, pressed close to his chest, was a small velvet box, holding the silver ring he had spent 6 months saving to buy, 6 months of eating sandwiches in the changing room so he could put aside every dollar he earned in tips. The ballroom of the Ashford Grand Hotel was so bright that evening it made him dizzy. 3 crystal chandeliers hung along the ceiling, their light spilling down and making the polished oak floor gleam like the surface of a frozen lake. Along both walls stood gold-framed mirrors reaching from floor to ceiling, multiplying the room into countless other rooms, and everywhere he looked there were tailcoats, gowns sweeping across the floor, and glasses of wine rising and falling to a rhythm he didn't know. A 4-piece ensemble played in the corner. The air was thick with perfume, scented wax, and the fragrance of lilies arranged in vases as tall as a person's chest. He stopped at the threshold and looked down at his shoes, cheap leather shoes faded at the toes, and for one moment he nearly turned around and left. Wendell Ashford saw him first. The man was standing at the far end of the ballroom with a glass in his hand, and he looked at Elias not with contempt, but with something else, something Elias wouldn't understand the name of until many winters later, when it was already too late. Wendell stared at him, then looked away, then looked back again, and something tightened in his jaw. Maren was sitting at a table near the window, wearing a wine-colored dress he had never seen before. Her hair swept up, and she looked so beautiful that his heart ached with a fear he couldn't explain. Preston Holloway stood beside her, one hand resting lightly on the back of her chair, leaning down to say something in her ear, and she laughed. Elias made his way through the crowd toward her. He called her name. Everyone at the table turned. He said he was sorry he was late, that his shift had run long, that there was something he needed to tell her. And as he spoke, he raised a hand to touch the velvet box inside his coat, only to make certain it was still there. Then Maren stood. She looked at him, and for one brief moment, so brief that he would later wonder whether he had imagined it, she looked at him as though she were about to step toward him. Then her face hardened. She said those words. She said them louder than necessary, loudly enough for the table beside them to hear, then the next table beyond it, and the words spread through the room like oil across water. The room's reaction came more slowly than he had expected. First, there was silence. A silence that lasted 3 heartbeats. The silence of 200 people, understanding all at once what was happening. Then, someone at a table behind him laughed, then someone else joined in. The laughter wasn't harsh or cruel. It was merely the weightless laughter of people who had just witnessed something amusing and would forget it before dessert was served. And that was precisely what made it so merciless. The musicians kept playing. A waiter passed with a tray of empty glasses and had to lean aside to avoid him. In the gold-framed mirrors lining both walls, Elias saw himself multiplied dozens of times. A young man in a white shirt that didn't fit across the shoulders, standing frozen in the middle of a sea of people dressed for a formal evening. And in every one of those reflected rooms, that young man stood alone. Preston smiled. He didn't say a word. He merely held out his hand to Maren, and she placed hers in it, and they walked toward the dance floor without her looking back even once. Elias remained where he was until the music ended. The ring was still in his coat pocket, pressed against his chest, warmed by the heat of his own body. He walked all 4 miles home through the December night, because he couldn't afford a taxi, and because he didn't want to sit still. The next morning, on the pressed wood table in the room he shared, lay an envelope he had opened the week before. Inside was his acceptance letter for evening law classes, along with the deadline for paying his first semester's tuition. He read it again, very slowly, from the first line to the last. Then he tore it in half, tore it once more, and dropped the pieces into the trash. He put on his coat, took the train to Bridgeport, walked 3 blocks through the snow, and knocked on the door of Uncle Augie's red brick house. The door opened. The man standing inside looked at Elias's face, then down at his tightly clenched fists, and didn't ask a single question. He merely stepped back, opened the door wider, and told him to come inside because it was bitterly cold out there. Elias didn't go home. He drove straight to the glass tower on Michigan Avenue, took the private elevator to the 41st floor, and when he entered his office, the city below was still submerged in the milky white light of a snowstorm morning. He removed his coat, hung it on the rack, sat down behind the walnut desk that stretched before him like a boat, and picked up the telephone. The call lasted less than 40 seconds. He didn't give his name, explain himself, or ask whether it would inconvenience anyone. He simply read out a name, the name of an all-night diner beneath Wacker Drive, then added 4 words, saying that he needed everything. 30 minutes later, Odessa Vance walked into the office without knocking and placed 3 thick files and a cup of black coffee on the desk. She wore a gray coat, her blonde hair tied low, and she didn't sit down. "You're not going to like this," she said. Elias opened the first file. Blue Hour Diner, 32 seats, open throughout the night, leasing the ground floor of a 4-story building on the corner. The building was owned by a real estate company identified by 3 initials, and those 3 letters appeared in the portfolio of assets his corporation had acquired as a package the previous fall. One of 41 properties in a transaction he had reviewed only in summary. Before giving his approval, he opened the second file. Lakeside Linen, an industrial laundry with 217 employees, serving 11 hotels and 3 hospitals in the downtown area. A subsidiary, second tier. Buried beneath the hotel services division, he had folded into the corporation 3 years earlier and had never once visited since. He turned to the employee roster. Her name appeared on the 89th line, morning shift, folding and sorting department, hired 11 months earlier. Elias sat for a long time with his index finger resting on that name. Outside the window, the snow kept falling. So for 11 months, the woman he had spent 9 winters hating had worked beneath his roof, folding towels for his hotels, serving coffee inside his building, and neither of them had known. A dry laugh rose somewhere in his mind, then died at once, because he had turned to the third file. The third was thinner than the other two. Odessa had clipped a small yellow note to the first page, and she was still standing there with her arms folded across her chest, watching him. Inside were 2 workplace inspection reports issued to Lakeside Linen by the Illinois Department of Labor. The first report, from the previous spring, documented the scheduling of 23 employees for shifts exceeding the limit on consecutive working hours, along with a recommendation that the violation be corrected. The second, from the fall, stated that the practice had continued, that the number of affected employees had risen to 41, and imposed an administrative fine that the legal department had paid within 9 days before closing the file. In the lower right corner of both pages, inside the box reserved for authorization, was an abbreviated signature. 2 strokes and a small curve, written in haste. Elias looked at it and knew immediately that it was his, because that was how he signed every day, signing dozens of papers placed before him on busy mornings, signing while he spoke on the phone, signing as he stepped toward the elevator, signing as a habit of the hand rather than an act of the mind. He didn't remember these 2 pages. He didn't remember reading a single line of either one. He sank back into his chair, and for one very long moment, the room 41 floors above the ground was so silent that he could hear the wind striking the glass. "This," he said, his voice turning hoarse. "When did this reach my desk?" "Both times. It came through the legal department," Odessa replied. "They summarized it, recommended paying the fine, and you approved it. That's the procedure. You approve roughly 300 papers like these every month." I asked when this reached my desk. Odessa was silent for a moment. "The first one, 14 months ago. The second, 7 months ago." 7 months ago, Elias calculated, and the number appeared in his mind as cold as the point of a needle. 7 months ago, Maren Ashford had already been working at that laundry for 4 months. 7 months ago, she had been pregnant. 7 months ago, a piece of paper had lain on this walnut desk, saying that 41 human beings were being worked to exhaustion through one consecutive shift after another, with no room to breathe, and he had signed it with 2 strokes and a small curve before reaching for the next page. He thought of the alley behind the diner. He thought of the snow covering the back of her coat. He thought of Dr. Halloran's words, 16 hours a day, and the way she had said Maren, recited that number as though she were reading from a grocery list. For 9 winters, he had believed that life itself had punished that woman, that he had merely stood at a distance and watched justice take its course. Now, beneath the lights of the 41st floor, he looked at the 2 strokes and the small curve in the corner of the page and understood that he had never stood outside it at all. "Mr. Marchetti," Odessa said softly. He didn't look up. "Please leave me," he said. And when the door closed, Elias Marchetti sat alone in the highest room of his building, both hands pressed over his face, unable for the first time in 9 winters to find anyone else to blame. 4 days later, when Dr. Halloran signed Maren's discharge papers on the condition that she return for a follow-up examination every week, Hank Delaney drove her to the glass tower on Michigan Avenue, and she waited in the row of chairs outside the office on the 41st floor, wearing clothes someone had bought for her, a gray sweater and a thick coat, neither expensive, but warm. The door to the inner office stood partly open. A man was speaking inside, and his voice kept rising. A man named Doyle, the owner of a construction materials company, who was rapidly explaining discrepancies in the amount of cement used at 3 union construction sites. Maren heard him say that it was the warehouse department's fault, that he would make up the difference in the next quarter, and that he hoped Mr. Marchetti would understand his circumstances. Then another voice spoke. It was very quiet, so quiet that she had to lean forward to hear it clearly, and it said only one sentence, asking how many people would stand beneath those columns over the next 20 years. Silence followed. The door opened. The man named Doyle walked out, his face as white as paper, his tie crooked, and he passed Maren without even seeing her. Inside, Elias remained seated in his chair. He hadn't even turned toward Doyle as he left. He hadn't stood once during the entire conversation. Maren entered, and for the first time, she understood that the man who had counted every dollar in tips inside a changing room 9 winters earlier now needed only to lower his voice to make a grown man walk trembling from the room. Elias pushed a stack of papers toward her. "Sit down." She sat, both hands resting in her lap. "You're leaving Lakeside Linen as of today," he said. "The night shift at the diner, too. Your termination letters have already been sent." Her head snapped up. You have no right. I do. He didn't say it loudly or triumphantly. He simply placed it on the desk as a fact. Both places belong to me. You've been working for me for 11 months, Marin. You didn't know. Neither did I. Now we both do. She stared at him, her lips parting and then closing again. This is a new contract, he continued, tapping one finger against the papers. My father left behind a mass of personal papers that were never organized. Ledgers, letters, records, photographs, dozens of boxes. No one in the family has the patience to deal with them. Your job will be to sort and digitize everything. You'll work from home, at your own pace, with no one watching the clock. There's a 2-bedroom apartment in the Gold Coast, paid through the end of next year. Dr. Halloran will examine you every week, and the expenses have been taken care of. The salary is 4 times what you were earning before. Marin looked down at the papers for a long time. Outside the window, snow swept past the 41st floor, not falling toward the ground, but flying upward in the wind. Why? She asked. Elias stood, walked to the window, and turned his back to her. You want to hear something kind, don't you? You want me to say I pity you, or that I forgive you, or that God teaches us to help those in need. He turned around. That isn't what this is. This isn't mercy. You'll live in the apartment I pay for, eat with the salary I pay you, and see the doctor with the insurance I bought. Every morning when you wake up, you'll remember who made that possible. That's control, Marin. That's what I want. A long silence followed. Then Marin picked up the contract with both hands and threw it onto the walnut desk. It slid across the surface before coming to a stop. She rose, slowly fastened each button of her coat, and walked out of the office without another word. Hank started to follow, but Elias raised one hand. She rode the elevator down 41 floors, stepped out of the lobby, and walked along Michigan Avenue through the snow. She walked for a long time. She passed brightly lit storefronts, a saxophone player huddled beneath an awning with his instrument case open before him, and a line of people waiting for a bus. She walked until her feet inside, her old shoes had gone numb, and every breath rose before her in clouds of white. Then she stopped in front of a glass window, and in its reflection, she saw herself. A 31-year-old woman with tangled hair, 7 months pregnant, homeless, unemployed, without a single living relative left in the world. She raised one hand and placed it over her stomach, and stood there in the snow for a very long time. Then she turned back. When the office door opened for the second time, Elias was still sitting exactly where she had left him, and the contract remained where she had thrown it. Marin walked over, pulled out the chair, sat down, and reached for the pen. I want you to understand one thing, she said, her voice perfectly calm. I'm not signing this for myself. If it were only me, I'd rather walk out of here and sleep at the train station tonight than take a single dollar from you. She placed her other hand over her stomach. But it isn't only me, and this baby doesn't owe you anything. It doesn't owe me anything either. It didn't get to choose its mother. So I'm signing. She signed. Her handwriting trembled, but it didn't stop halfway through. Then she set down the pen, pushed the papers toward him, and raised her eyes to meet his directly. You just told me that you want me to wake up every morning remembering who did this, she said. Fine, but I want you to know something too. You've just become the very thing I tried to save you from all those years ago. Elias sat motionless. What did you just say? But Marin was already on her feet. She fastened the top button of her coat again, gave him one brief nod, and walked toward the door. He heard her footsteps fading along the corridor, then the chime of the elevator, and then nothing at all. On the walnut desk, her signature hadn't even had time to dry. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening, Elias drove to Bridgeport and stopped at an old Italian restaurant on the corner. The kind of place with lace curtains in the windows and crooked black and white photographs hanging on the walls, where ordinary diners ate pasta in the front room without ever knowing that behind the kitchen was a door leading into another room. That room held only a long table covered with a white cloth and 8 wooden chairs. The ceiling was low. On the wall hung a faded olive wood crucifix and a photograph of 4 men standing in front of the harbor, all 4 of them now dead. When Elias entered, 3 people were already seated. Augie Marchetti sat at the head of the table, 61 years old, his large hands folded over each other, a napkin draped across his lap, even though there was no food on the table. Gideon Pryor sat on the left, his leather briefcase beneath his feet, thin framed glasses on his face, his hair neatly combed. Odessa Vance sat on the right, and before her lay a stack of papers turned face down. Elias hung his coat on a hook and took the chair at the far end of the table. No one greeted anyone. Odessa turned the papers over. 3 weeks, she said. I'm going to read this, and I won't offer any further comment. The hospital bill and all inpatient treatment at Mercy General. A private physician once a week, continuing beyond the delivery. A 2-bedroom apartment in the Gold Coast, paid through the end of next year. Private health insurance. A contract salary 4 times what she earned before, with 6 months paid in advance. And that doesn't include Hank's time. A man who has spent the last 3 weeks doing nothing but standing in hospital corridors and driving a woman back and forth to prenatal appointments. She closed the file. My job is to guard the flow of money through this organization, so I'm going to ask one question directly, and I'm asking it in front of everyone so no one can later say I asked it behind their backs. Are we going to bleed for a waitress? No one answered. Gideon removed his glasses and cleaned them very slowly, as though the motion spared him from having to meet anyone's eyes. Augie remained still, his hands folded together. She isn't one of ours, Odessa continued. She doesn't carry any name belonging to this family. She owes us nothing. And 9 winters ago, she did the thing this entire city still remembers. I'm not talking about morality. I don't care whether you owe her or she owes you. I'm talking only about the numbers. And the numbers are moving in the wrong direction. Elias placed both hands on the table. I signed 2 labor reports I never read, he said. 41 people were being worked to exhaustion through consecutive shifts, and I approved paying the fine so the matter could be closed. She was one of those 41. I know, Odessa said. I'm the one who gave you those reports. Then you know this isn't about what I owe her or what she owes me. I know, she repeated, but I still have to ask the question. Because if I don't, someone else will ask it 6 months from now, and that person won't be as polite as I am. That was when Augie Marchetti spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He merely lifted one hand from the table and set it down again. This boy's father once saved someone too, he said. Everyone in the room turned toward him. None of you were sitting here then except me. Salvatore saved a man who wasn't worth saving, and he knew the man wasn't worth it, and he did it anyway. It cost him 14 months in prison. His lung sickness began during the first winter, and by the second winter he couldn't get out of the infirmary bed. He died there, not because anyone beat him, because his lungs failed, and no one could be bothered to treat a man whose sentence was almost over. He looked around the table. So don't sit here and tell me this family isn't accustomed to bleeding for an outsider. This family has been doing that for a long time. The only questions are how much we bleed and who gets to decide. Then he turned toward his nephew. You decide. Elias reached for his left wrist. Slowly, he removed the steel watch with the cracked face and placed it in the middle of the white tablecloth, at the exact center of the table, where everyone could see it. Every person in that room understood what the gesture meant. Odessa closed the file and didn't say another word. Gideon put his glasses back on. Augie gave a very slight nod, then reached for the bottle of wine on the side table and poured 4 glasses, and the meeting was considered over. One by one, everyone stood. Elias put on his coat, picked up the watch, and was fastening his cufflink when he noticed that Gideon Pryor was still lingering beside him, his leather briefcase already in his hand. Just one small matter, Gideon said, his voice as light as if he were mentioning the weather. There will be paperwork eventually. An employment contract, medical bills, the apartment lease, perhaps even a court matter if the baby's father returns. The kind of paperwork that only creates trouble when it's scattered across 4 different places. Let me keep all of it for you. One place, one person, and no one but me will be allowed to touch it. He smiled, the smile of a man who had sat beside this family for 30 years. You take care of the important things. Leave the small matters to me. Elias nodded. Agreed, he said, and that was the word everyone in the organization knew carried more weight than any contract. The Gold Coast apartment was on the 9th floor of an old brown brick building, with high ceilings, wooden floors that creaked at the kitchen threshold, and a living room window overlooking a row of bare, snow-covered trees. Elias went there late one weekend afternoon to deliver the 4th box of records, and when he set it on the floor, he saw that the first 3 had already been opened, sorted, and arranged in neat stacks across the dining table, each stack clipped with a small note, marked with the month and year in rounded handwriting. Marin poured him a cup of tea even though he hadn't asked for one. then sat in the chair across from him, both hands wrapped around her own cup for warmth. Outside, the light was slowly fading. "If you want to ask, then ask," she said. "You've come here 4 times in the last 3 weeks, and you haven't asked once." Elias didn't avoid the question. "What happened to your family?" Maren looked down at her tea for a long time. "My father falsified the books," she said. "Not once. For nearly 4 years. He shifted the hotel chain's losses into several subsidiaries, recorded revenue that hadn't been collected as revenue already received, and borrowed money from the bank against those numbers. He told himself it would only be temporary, just for 1 quarter, then for 1 more quarter, and by the time he wanted to stop, he couldn't anymore. People call that fraud. It was fraud. I'm not going to sit here and defend him." She took a sip. When everything came apart, they searched his office on a Thursday morning. By noon, television vans were packed along the street in front of our house. My father was indicted. He was released while awaiting trial, and for almost a year after that, he lived in his study, sleeping in a chair, and never leaving the house. He didn't live long enough to stand trial. One morning, he was sitting in that chair when his heart stopped. The doctor said it was heart failure. They took him away in an ambulance, and he died at the hospital that afternoon. Elias said nothing. "My mother held herself together through the funeral," Maren continued. "She stood beside me at the cemetery, shook the hand of every person who came to offer condolences, and thanked them all. 3 weeks later, she left. She placed a letter on the kitchen table, exactly 11 lines long. She wrote that she couldn't live in a city where everyone knew her face, that she was sorry, and that she hoped I would understand one day. I don't know where she went. I didn't look for her. If someone writes 11 lines to explain why she is leaving, it means she has already thought it through very carefully." She set down her cup. "The house was sold to pay the debts. The furniture was auctioned. I managed to keep 3 boxes of belongings and 1 suitcase." Elias asked the next question, the one he had waited 3 weeks to ask. "What about Preston?" Maren remained silent for a moment. "He came back 2 months after the funeral," she said. "He brought flowers. He sat in my empty living room and told me he felt guilty for disappearing after the scandal, that his family had pressured him, and that he no longer cared what anyone said. I believed him. Do you want to know why I believed him? Because by then, there was no one else in the world who called me. Not one person. My phone had been silent for 2 months." She drew a breath. Then he began talking about business. He said there was a way to recover part of what my father had lost, that all he needed was the initial capital, and that the Ashford name still carried weight with the bank. He needed someone to act as guarantor. I signed, not 1 paper, but 17, spread across nearly a year, 1 or 2 at a time, and every time he told me it was the last one. I didn't read them carefully. I was 26 years old. I had just buried my father. My mother had just left, and he was the only person who still sat with me inside that house. She looked directly at Elias. Then I became pregnant. I told him on a Friday evening. He didn't argue, become angry, or say a single cruel thing. He only went quiet and said he needed time to think. 9 days later, I woke up and he was gone. The joint account was empty. His phone was disconnected, and all 17 papers still had my name at the bottom. The only sound in the room was the soft crackling of the heater. "Why didn't you come to me?" Elias asked. The words escaped before he had time to consider them, and the instant he spoke, he heard how they sounded. Maren looked up. She wasn't angry. She only looked at him with an exhaustion so deep that it sent a chill down his spine. For what?" she asked. "So I could stand in the lobby of your building with a suitcase in my hand and ask to see Mr. Marchetti? And then what? You would give me money, and I would take it. And from that moment until the end of my life, I would be the woman who went begging for money from the man she abandoned." Slowly, she shook her head. "Do you think I didn't know how you would look at me? I knew exactly. And that was precisely how you looked at me in that alley that night. Elias, don't say it wasn't." He had no answer. "So I waited tables," she said. "At least there, no one knew who I used to be." Elias went home that evening, but he didn't go up to his apartment. He went down to the security room in the basement of his office building, where one wall was covered with black and white monitors, and asked the guard on duty to retrieve archived footage from the basement of Lakeside Linen, the morning shift, from the previous months. Once the footage was on the screen, the guard left. Elias remained alone. On the monitor was a long basement room beneath fluorescent lights, with rows of stainless steel racks piled with white towels like low walls. And in the middle of that room stood a small woman folding towels, alone, with no one else working that shift. The camera had no sound, but he could see her lips moving, see her shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm, see her bend down for the next towel and lift her head again, and he recognized that rhythm at once. It was an old melody her mother used to sing, the one Marin had hummed in his car 9 winters earlier on the nights he drove her home after work, when between them they owned nothing but an old car and a broken heater. Elias rewound the footage. He watched it again, then once more. Then he reached out and turned off the screen, and sat motionless in the darkness of that room for a very long time. So long that when he finally stood, both of his legs had gone numb. The 7th box was the hardest. The first 6 had all contained the papers of a meticulous man. Bills clipped together by month, harbor ledgers tied with string, letters arranged by sender, and Marin had grown so familiar with Salvatore Marchetti's handwriting that one glance at the beginning of a line was enough to tell her whether he had written it in haste or at leisure. But the 7th box was a mess. It had been packed in a hurry, papers crammed on top of one another, with an envelope of tomato seeds and a tin of screws rolling loose among the files. She guessed it was the box someone had cleared from his office after his arrest, packed quickly by a person who didn't know what mattered and what didn't. She worked on the living room floor throughout that afternoon, her back resting against the sofa, one hand occasionally rising to support her belly whenever the baby kicked. Beyond the window, the snow had stopped falling, and the city had taken on the blue-gray color of a January afternoon. She made 3 piles. The first was harbor paperwork. The second was family correspondence. The third held everything she didn't yet know how to classify. Halfway down the box, wedged between 2 bundles of fuel receipts, she found a brownish-yellow cardboard folder with curled edges. Across the cover, written in blue ink in the same handwriting she had been reading for the past 3 weeks, were 2 capitalized words: Marin Ashford. She sat perfectly still. The baby kicked once, then stopped. In the upper right corner of the folder was a date, and Marin had to read it 3 times before she believed her own eyes, because it was from the autumn before that first winter, nearly 3 months before the night at the Ashford Grand Ballroom, 3 months before she had risen from that table and spoken those words, 3 months before everything began. She placed the folder on her lap and opened it. There wasn't much inside. 4 pages. The first was a photograph printed on old photographic paper, slightly blurred, taken through the windshield from inside another car. The sweep of a windshield wiper was visible in the upper corner. The photograph showed the front of the house where she had grown up, the iron fence, the 2 maple trees beside the entrance, the stone steps. Parked directly outside the gate was a dark sedan she didn't recognize. The picture had been taken during the day. No one appeared in the frame. The second page was another photograph, taken from the same angle, showing the same car, but in different light, perhaps late in the afternoon on another day. The third was a sheet of graph paper torn from a notebook, on which Salvatore had written a short list, 4 lines. Each line contained a date and a time. There were no other notes. The 4th page was the one that made Marin's hands begin to tremble. It too had been torn from a notebook, and it held only a single line, written larger than the others in darker ink, as though Salvatore had pressed the pen hard against the paper. It was a name, and the name had been crossed out, not with a single stroke. He had drawn over it again and again, back and forth, with such force that the tip of the pen had torn through the paper in 2 places, and the layers of ink were now so thick that after all those winters, there was no way to read what had once been written beneath them. Marin held the page up toward the window. She tilted it into the light, turned it, and studied it. She could see the length of the crossed-out name. She could tell it contained 2 words. She thought she could make out part of a letter rising near the end, but that was all. She lowered the paper to her lap and sat motionless in the darkening room. Elias's father had created a file bearing her name. He had sent someone to sit in a car and photograph her family's home. He had recorded dates and times, and he had done all of it 3 months before the night everything collapsed. 3 months before she opened her mouth and spoke the sentence that had nailed her in place for 9 winters. 2 thoughts rose in Marin's mind at once and fought each other. The first told her that Salvatore had been investigating her, that he had distrusted her, that he hadn't wanted his son involved with an Ashford girl and had gone searching for evidence to prove she was unworthy. And if that was true, then for the past 9 winters, she had been on a dead man's blacklist without ever knowing it. The second thought was fainter and less certain, no more than a draft slipping through the crack beneath a door, and it told her that something didn't fit, that if Salvatore had wanted to investigate her, he would have photographed her, not a stranger's car parked outside her gate. She heard the elevator stop in the corridor outside on the 9th floor. Then footsteps passed her door and faded away. Maren looked down at the brownish-yellow folder in her lap and thought about calling Elias. She imagined placing it on the desk before him and saying, "Here, I found this. Explain it to me." Then she remembered the way he had spoken to her in the office on the 41st floor, telling her that this wasn't mercy, that it was control. She imagined him looking at the photographs, then looking at her, with only one question in his mind. What else had the Ashford family kept from his father? Maren didn't have the strength to endure another look like that. Not now. Not when she was 2 months away from giving birth and had nowhere else to go. She returned the 4 pages to the folder, closed the cover, and smoothed its curled edge. Then she lifted all 3 piles she had sorted from the 7th box, placed the brownish-yellow folder at the very bottom, and stacked every paper on top of it. She closed the box. She sat in the darkness with her back against the sofa and both hands resting on her belly, and on the 9th floor of a brown brick building in the Gold Coast, she was the only person in the world who knew that the crossed-out name existed. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, tucked between the electric bill and a bundle of supermarket advertisements. It was thicker than an ordinary letter, made of ivory paper, with the seal of the Cook County Family Court printed in the upper left corner. Maren opened it while standing in the shared hallway on the 9th floor, and she read all 3 pages without moving a single step. A petition to establish paternity and a petition for guardianship of an unborn child, filed by petitioner Preston Holloway through a law office on LaSalle Avenue. A hearing date had already been scheduled. On the final page, beneath the section listing the grounds for the petitions, one line stated that the respondent currently had no stable employment, no residence registered in her own name, and was entirely dependent upon a third party for both living and medical expenses. Maren folded the 3 pages with great care, went inside, closed the door, and stood with her back against it for a long time. Then she did 3 things. She put a kettle of water on to boil. She took out her phone, opened the recording application, pressed the button, and placed it face down on the bookshelf in the corner of the living room, directly behind an empty picture frame. The third thing she did was sit down and wait. She didn't have to wait long. The doorbell rang less than 2 hours later, and when she opened the door, Preston Holloway stood outside holding a slim leather briefcase, dressed in a camel-colored wool coat over a white shirt without a single wrinkle, the kind of shirt she knew was professionally laundered and delivered to his home every week. He hadn't brought flowers this time. "Hello, Maren," he said. "May I come in?" She stepped back and allowed him inside. He crossed the threshold and looked around the apartment, at the high ceilings, the wooden floors, and the 3 boxes of records stacked beside the dining table, and something very close to satisfaction passed across his face. He removed his coat, draped it over the back of a chair, and sat down without waiting to be invited. "You received the letter this morning. Good. Then we don't have to waste time." He opened his briefcase, removed a set of documents, and placed them on the table facing her. "I'm going to speak in numbers, because I know you understand numbers. Your father understood them better than I ever did, although in the end, he used them the wrong way." Maren didn't answer. "The Ashford Trust," he said, turning to the 2nd page. "It was created by your grandfather, not your father, so it wasn't part of the assets seized when the hotel chain collapsed. 3 properties remain in the trust, 2 rows of rental buildings on the west side, and a parcel of riverfront land covering nearly 4 acres. That land is the only thing I care about, because my development runs along the river, and that parcel lies directly in the middle of it. Without it, 4 years of my work will have meant nothing. I was removed from the trust," Maren said. "That's right," Preston replied with a calm nod. "The exclusion clause was triggered during the bankruptcy settlement. You permanently lost your status as a beneficiary. It can't be challenged again. I had people examine that very carefully." He turned another page. "But the trust states that it exists for the direct descendants of the person who created it. Direct descendants, Maren. It isn't about you. It's about the bloodline." He looked up. "You understand what I'm saying?" Maren sat perfectly still. "Legally," Preston continued, "a beneficiary who is a minor can't make decisions concerning property held in trust. The The legal guardian has the authority to act on the child's behalf, and if real estate belonging to the trust must be transferred, the guardian is the one who signs, subject to court approval. That's the entire matter. Nothing more. You want a signature? She said. I want a legally valid signature, he corrected her. And I want it obtained in a way that no one can overturn 10 years from now. That's why I'm going through the court instead of coming here to beg you. He closed the documents. Now I'm going to tell you the part you won't like. My case has 3 points. First, income. You have an employment contract signed with an individual, not a business with a public payroll. And your job is to organize the private papers of a deceased man. My attorney will ask the court how many jobs like that exist in the Chicago labor market, and pay 4 times the wages of an industrial laundry. Second, housing. Your name isn't on this apartment. You don't pay the rent. You have no lease bearing your name. Third, medical expenses. He paused for a moment. Every dollar is paid by one man. Marin looked directly at him. Finish it. All right. Preston rested both elbows on the table. How will the judge see you, Marin? I'm asking honestly, not to frighten you. A 31-year-old woman with no assets and no independent income, living in an apartment paid for by Elias Marchetti, eating on a salary paid by Elias Marchetti, and seeing doctors through insurance purchased by Elias Marchetti. I have a house in my name, a company, 7 consecutive years of tax returns, and 3 letters of recommendation from people the judge dines with on Saturday evenings. He said all of it in the voice of a man reading from a balance sheet. The court doesn't ask who loves more. The court asks who is more stable. Those are 2 different questions, and you will lose on the second one. A long silence followed. Beyond the window, a bus passed, its brakes shrieking before it rolled on. I have a way out for you, Preston said. You withdraw your objection. My paternity and guardianship are established through the ordinary process. You receive a one-time settlement large enough to buy a small house in the suburbs and never work another night shift waiting tables. No one has to fight in court. No one has to hear my attorney read those 3 points aloud before the judge. He pushed a business card across the table. Think about it, but think quickly, because the hearing has already been scheduled, and the court doesn't move its calendar for anyone. Marin stood. She rose slowly, one hand braced against the table, and she didn't pick up the business card. Go home, Preston. He watched her for a moment, then smiled, the perfectly courteous smile of a man who had finished making his case and knew he had nothing more to say. He put on his coat, tucked the leather briefcase beneath his arm, and stepped into the hallway. Thank you for receiving me, he said from the threshold. Then the door closed. Marin remained where she was until the sound of the elevator had completely faded. She walked to the bookshelf in the corner, reached behind the empty picture frame, and turned her phone over. The numbers on the screen were still moving, and the tiny red dot beside them remained steadily lit, without having gone dark for a single second throughout the past 23 minutes. Marin called Elias that same afternoon, and she didn't circle around the matter. She simply told him that a letter had come from the court, that Preston had visited, and that she had recorded everything. Elias listened to the entire recording twice in his car, once on the way to the apartment, and again after parking in the basement of his office building, the earphones plugged into his phone, both hands resting motionless on the steering wheel. When it ended, he called Gideon Pryor and said only that there was a recording and a set of court documents that needed to be analyzed before morning. Then he printed a copy of the petition, clipped it to everything Odessa had discovered about Preston's company over the previous 2 days, and placed it all inside the black leather briefcase on the passenger seat. It was nearly 11 o'clock that night when he and Hank took the elevator down to the second basement level to retrieve the car. At that hour, the underground garage was almost empty. Only 7 or 8 cars remained, scattered among the spaces marked with white lines, and along the low concrete ceiling, one of the fluorescent lights above the driving lane was failing, flickering in a steady rhythm. Bright and then dark, bright and then dark, making the entire garage stutter like an old film. Melted snow dripped from beneath the parked cars and spread into irregular pools across the floor, reflecting the lights in glimmering patches. Hank walked half a step ahead, as he always did, his right hand resting loosely at his side, and he was the first to stop. There was the sound of engines, not one engine, but several, and they weren't starting from inside the garage. They were coming from the ramp leading down. Then headlights swept across the concrete wall in front of them, sliding sideways in a blinding glare, and tires screamed against the wet floor, the long, piercing sound striking the low ceiling and rebounding in echoes. A small truck rushed down and stopped sideways across the upward ramp. Two more swung around the row of pillars and advanced from the opposite end, blocking the exit beside the stairwell. All three slammed to a stop at the same moment. "Between the two columns," Hank said, his voice low and level, as though he were remarking that rain was on the way. Doors opened. 4 men stepped out, then 2 more, their faces covered with scarves, and they said nothing. They didn't shout, issue orders, or make demands, and it was that silence that made Elias understand this wasn't a robbery. The man in front swung his arm. The window beside the driver's seat of the black car exploded with a short, dry crack, and shards of glass poured across the concrete in a clattering rush like hail striking a metal roof. Then the second window, then the taillight. Elias stepped forward, but Hank reached behind him, seized the shoulder of his coat, and forced him down into the space between 2 parked cars, turning his own back toward the attackers as he did. Elias heard the impact. He heard Hank draw one sharp breath. He heard shoes sliding across the wet floor, something metal striking the ground and rolling away, and the fluorescent light continuing to flicker above them, bright and then dark, bright and then dark. Then Elias rose. He didn't shout. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped out from between the 2 cars and walked directly toward the man in front, moving swiftly and decisively. And perhaps it was because he didn't run that the man lost half a second. Elias turned him, drove him forward, and pinned him against the hood of a nearby car with the full weight of his forearm pressed across the man's chest. The metal buckled with a dull thud. The scarf slipped halfway down the man's face. Elias didn't strike him. He held him there, leaned in very close, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that only the 2 of them could hear. "Listen carefully," he said. "Then go back and repeat this to the man who paid you. I don't buy people with money. Anyone can be bought with money. I buy with time. I'll wait. I'll wait longer than he can, longer than he'll live, and one day he'll understand that the thing he can't afford to pay isn't money." Elias released him. The man staggered backward, breathing hard, and pulled the scarf over his face again. For 2 seconds, he stood there staring at Elias without understanding what had just happened. Then one of the others whistled. They all withdrew. Doors slammed. The 3 vehicles reversed, their tires shrieking once more across the wet concrete, then raced back up the ramp and vanished, leaving their echoes trapped in the concrete for several more seconds. Then came silence. There was only the faint crackling of the fluorescent light and the sound of water dripping somewhere at the far end of the garage. Hank managed to stand, one hand braced against his ribs, and waved Elias away when he approached. "It's nothing. Just needs to be wrapped." Elias looked around. Both side windows of his car were shattered. The taillights were broken. A long dent ran across the rear door, but the black leather briefcase remained untouched on the passenger seat, right there, within easy reach through the shattered window. He opened the door, picked it up, released the clasps, and counted everything again. The petition, the files Odessa had sent, and the printed transcript of the recording. It was all there. Not one page was missing. He stood with the briefcase in his hand, and for an instant, something passed through his mind, a faint thought that hadn't yet taken shape. But then Hank coughed, and the thought disappeared. As Elias reached for his coat on the back seat, the wallet in the inner pocket caught against the edge of the door and fell open onto the concrete floor. Several cards slid out. Something smaller and rounder fell with them, rolled a short distance, and came to rest in a pool of melted snow. A tarnished silver ring made from cheap metal. The ring, a young man of 25, had once spent 6 months saving to buy. It lay there, bright and then dark beneath the rhythm of the failing light. Elias didn't see it. He was bending down to gather the cards. Hank Delaney did. He stepped forward, bent very slowly because of his ribs, picked up the ring, dried it against the hem of his coat, then slipped it into the left breast pocket and fastened the button. He said nothing. He merely straightened and asked whether Mr. Marchetti wanted him to call for another car. Gideon Pryor arrived at the office on the 41st floor the next morning, 20 minutes before their scheduled meeting, and he didn't sit down. He placed his leather briefcase on the desk, released the locks, and removed a thin file with a gray cover. "You asked me to find everything there was about Preston Holloway," he said. "I did. I found a great deal, and I'll show you all of it. But there's one page I have to give you first, because if I give it to you later, you'll ask why I kept it from you." He He drew out a photocopied page with slightly blurred edges and small lettering in the typewritten style of an old form. While tracing Holloway, I had to retrieve every record connected to the harbor cases from that same period. And I came across this. He pushed the page across the walnut desk. This is the source summary from the raid that year. Your father's case. Elias didn't pick it up immediately. He looked at the paper lying on the desk, and for one very long moment, he stared only at its slightly curled edge. Then he drew it toward him. At the top was the case number, the date it was created, and the name of the agency. In the middle were lines of technical abbreviations he didn't fully understand. And near the bottom, inside a small box, clearly labeled as the person who had provided the initial information, was a name typed in capital letters, including the middle initial. Wendell J. Ashford. Elias read it. He read it a second time, more slowly, tracing each letter with his finger like a child learning to read. Then he read it a third time, 3 times, the same name, unchanged. Outside the window, the January sun was climbing above the lake, casting a stream of cold, white light into the center of the room. And within that light, specks of dust hung suspended without falling. You should sit down, Gideon said softly. Her father, Elias said. His voice didn't rise. It simply became very flat as the surface of ice. That's what the paper says, Gideon replied. I'm not saying anything beyond what's written there. Her father gave them my father's name. You're reading the same thing I read. Elias stood. He walked to the window and remained there with his back to Gideon. Both hands braced against the ledge, and 41 floors above the ground stood a man looking down at a city he had spent 9 winters buying one piece at a time. He thought of the prison infirmary. He thought of 2 winters, of lungs slowly failing, of the news arriving at home on a March morning while his mother was still hanging laundry in the kitchen. He thought of the past 3 weeks, of the 4 boxes of records carried up to the 9th floor, of the cup of tea she had poured without being asked, of the rhythm of her shoulders rising and falling on the black and white monitor in the basement of the laundry. Then he thought of how, throughout all that time, the woman sitting across from him had carried that name. He didn't break anything. He didn't say another word to Gideon. He returned to the desk, picked up the telephone, pressed 3 internal numbers, and when someone answered at the other end, he said only a few words. Odessa. End everything. Today. Then he put down the receiver. Odessa Vance arrived at the Gold Coast apartment shortly after noon. She wore a gray coat, her hair tied low, and she didn't step fully inside. She remained in the space between the doorway and the hall. On the dining table, 3 stacks of papers were still arranged neatly, each clipped with a small note marked with the month and year. The 7th box stood closed in the corner. The agreement is over, Odessa said. She placed a white envelope on the table. There's a check inside. It covers the remaining 6 months of salary under the contract, along with the medical expenses for this quarter. No one is asking for anything back. You don't owe a thing. Marin looked at the envelope without touching it. Where is he? He isn't coming. I asked where he is. Miss Ashford, Odessa said, and there was no cruelty in her voice, only the firmness of someone accustomed to doing things like this. I was sent here to finish a task, not to explain it. A car is waiting downstairs. It will take you anywhere you want to go in the city. You can take your time packing. Marin stood motionless for a long time. Then she went into the bedroom and retrieved her only suitcase, the one that had been with her since the day the house was sold, and she packed slowly, without rushing, without dropping anything. As she passed the dining table, she reached out and smoothed the small note marking the month and year on the top stack, a tiny gesture, as though she feared that someone might later fail to understand how she had organized the papers. Then she took the keys from her coat pocket and placed them on the table beside the white envelope she hadn't opened. Please give him one message for me, Marin said. Odessa nodded. Tell him my father died because of a signature. She pulled the suitcase toward the door. And he is living because of that very same signature. Then she walked into the corridor, and Odessa could hear the suitcase wheels rattling across the wooden floor all the way to the elevator. Marin didn't use the car waiting below. She took the train south, all the way to Wacker Drive, and knocked on the back door of the Blue Hour Diner after nightfall. Bernadette Kowalski opened it, looked at the suitcase, looked at Marin's pregnant belly, then looked into her face, and didn't ask a single question. She simply held the door wider and jerked her head toward the narrow staircase leading upstairs. "The room up there is cold," she said. "The blankets are in the closet. I've still got a pot of soup down here." Elias arrived at the Gold Coast apartment near midnight. He hadn't intended to go there. He had merely driven around the city for hours until, in the end, the wheels carried him there. He unlocked the door with his own key. No one was inside. The heat was still running. The kitchen light was still on, and an unopened white envelope lay on the dining table beside a set of keys. He stood in the middle of the room for a very long time. Then Odessa called and repeated exactly what Maren had said, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, her voice even over the telephone. Elias listened to the end. He didn't ask her to repeat it. He ended the call and remained standing in the empty apartment, the phone still in his hand, with no understanding at all of what the woman had just told him. 3 days later, Maren took 2 trains and a bus to Bridgeport because what she carried in her handbag didn't belong to her, and she didn't want to keep it for another night. Inside the bag was the brownish-yellow folder bearing her name, the one she had pulled from the bottom of the 7th box before leaving the Gold Coast apartment. And throughout the journey, she kept telling herself that she was going there only to return it to the family of the man who had written it, and then she would leave. The red brick house stood in the middle of the row, with 2 cement steps, a withered plant in a pot beside the door, and a yellowed lace curtain hanging in the front window. Maren stood at the foot of the steps for a long time before ringing the bell. The woman who opened the door was about 65, with silver hair gathered into a bun at the nape of her neck and a buttoned sweater, and she looked at Maren's pregnant belly before raising her eyes to her face. "Good Lord," she said. "How long have you been standing out there? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bother you. Come in. Come inside first." Before Maren could finish, the woman had drawn her in, shut the door against the wind, and told her to sit in the armchair near the fireplace. The house was warm and smelled of dried orange peel. A row of framed photographs stood along the mantel, most of them old, and in the center was a picture of a middle-aged man standing in front of the harbor, both hands in his pockets, smiling at whoever held the camera. Rosalind Marchetti brought out a tea tray without asking whether Maren wanted anything. She poured, pushed a cup toward her, then sat in the chair opposite and placed both hands in her lap. "How far along are you?" 8 months. "A boy or a girl?" "A boy." Rosalind nodded and smiled a little. "Boys like to kick at night. Mine used to wait until the moment I lay down. Then he would start kicking." She took a sip of tea. "Who are you a friend of in this family? Or did you come to ask about something?" Maren opened her mouth, but no words came. The folder lay inside the handbag at her feet, and she realized that if she took it out now, she would have to explain who she was. And if she told this woman who she was, Rosalind wouldn't pour her a second cup of tea. I was doing some work involving Mr. Salvatore Marchetti's papers," she said. "I was organizing his records." Rosalind's face brightened. Oh, so you're the person my boy hired. He mentioned it, but he didn't say you were a young woman expecting a baby." She set down her cup. "My husband kept so many papers. He even saved receipts for screws he bought 30 years ago. Can you believe that?" A silence followed. Then Rosalind looked into the fire, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. "You know, many people in this neighborhood think I lost one person from my family. The truth is, I lost 2. Maren scarcely dared to breathe. "My husband died in the prison infirmary. Everyone around here knows that. His lungs failed, and by the 2nd winter, he couldn't get out of bed. The news came on a March morning while I was hanging laundry in the kitchen." She smoothed a crease in the skirt across her lap. "No one knows about the 2nd one because he's still breathing. He still eats, drives his car, calls me every week, and gives me money I never spend. But my boy is dead, child. He died the night he tore up that paper." Maren looked up. "What paper?" "His acceptance letter. Law school. Evening classes. He got in, you know. He hid it from me for an entire month before telling me because he was afraid he would jinx it if he spoke too soon." She laughed, a very brief and very sad laugh. "The next morning, I went into his room to clean and found the letter in the trash, torn into 4 pieces. I picked them up, taped them back together, and kept it in a drawer all these years. I kept thinking, foolishly, that perhaps one day he would need it." She was silent for a while. "From that day on, he worked for his uncle. Then he became rich. Then he bought me a house in a respectable neighborhood, but I refused to move. Yet the boy who used to sit in the chair you're sitting in and tell me about his day at school never came home again." Rosalind stood, walked to a low wooden cabinet in the corner, opened the bottom drawer, and removed a tin cookie box. She placed it on the table and lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with twine, their envelopes yellowed with age, all postmarked from the prison. "My husband wrote them," she said. "One every week. Some weeks, he managed only 3 lines because his hands were shaking." She pushed the entire box toward Marin. "Go ahead and read them. You're the one organizing his papers, so you're allowed." Marin picked up the first letter, her hand trembling. The handwriting was the same she had grown familiar with over the past 3 weeks, but smaller and less steady, and every letter spoke only of little things. He asked whether the lemon tree behind the house had borne fruit that year. He reminded her to check the pipes in the basement before the cold weather came. He told her about a fellow prisoner who was teaching him to play chess, and how he had lost every game for 3 months. Not one letter mentioned the trial. Not one blamed anyone. Not a single line contained the name of the person who had put him there. Not even an initial. The last letter lay at the bottom of the box without an envelope. Only a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and it was unfinished. The handwriting had grown very weak, the letters overlapping near the ends of the lines. He wrote that he wouldn't make it to spring. He wrote that he didn't regret what he had done, and that he was sorry he couldn't explain it then, because some things had to be said while sitting face to face, and couldn't be said on paper. Then he wrote a passage for his son. He wrote that he knew the boy was angry. That anger was useful for the first 6 months, but after that, it began eating its way back into the person carrying it. That the road anger chose for a man was always the straightest and shortest road, and precisely because of that, it always passed through places where no one was waiting at the end. He told his son not to let anger choose his life for him. That was the last sentence he managed to write. After it, the page was blank. Marin read the sentence 3 times, and on the third, her tears fell onto the edge of the paper, and she hurried to wipe them away, afraid the ink would run. Rosalind said nothing. She merely reached across the table, placed her aged hand over Marin's cracked one, and held it there. Outside, the January wind slipped through the window frame and gently stirred the lace curtain. Elias couldn't sleep that night, and a little after 11 o'clock, he drove to the old office building on Dearborn Street, where Gideon Pryor had kept a suite of 3 rooms on the 6th floor for the past 30 years. Elias had a key. He had always had one, just as Gideon had always possessed a key to his offices, because in this family, no one thought there was any need to lock doors against one another. The corridor was dark, lit only by the emergency lights at either end, and inside the office, the smells of old paper and wood polish blended into a scent Elias had known since he was a boy sitting outside and waiting for his father. He had come for the Preston Holloway file. Gideon had taken it home that afternoon and promised to finish reviewing everything that night, and Elias didn't want to wait until morning. The safe stood inside a recess in the wall behind a framed print of the harbor, an old upright safe with 3 compartments. And the combination was Gideon's wedding date, a number everyone in the organization knew because he had never agreed to change it. Elias turned the dial. The steel door opened. He reached into the middle compartment, but his fingers caught the edge of a cardboard file in the one below, and the entire stack of papers inside slid out and spilled across the carpet. He bent down to gather them. Then he stopped. On the floor beneath the light spilling from the desk lamp lay 9 envelopes. They had scattered into the shape of a fan, and every one bore the same handwriting, rounded and leaning slightly to the right, the handwriting he had seen on the small notes clipped to the 3 stacks of records in the Gold Coast apartment. Every envelope was addressed to him. Every envelope had been sent to the corporate office, and each one bore a red postal stamp marking it as returned to the sender, along with the printed words, "Addressee unknown." Elias sat down on the floor. He arranged the 9 envelopes before him in the order of their postmarks, and they stretched into a long line spanning 9 winters, one from each winter, always sometime around December. Inside every envelope was a sheet of paper folded into thirds, and beside each original was a neatly stapled photocopy, numbered in pencil at the corner. Someone had read them. Someone had read every letter, copied every letter, numbered every letter, then hidden them all in the lowest compartment of a safe whose combination was a wedding date. Elias didn't read what they said. He wasn't strong enough. Not then. He only looked at that rounded, slightly slanted handwriting, 9 times across 9 winters, and thought of the question Marin had asked him in the apartment that afternoon, asking what she was supposed to do, stand in the lobby of his building with a suitcase in her hand, and ask to see Mr. Marchetti. She hadn't stood in the lobby. She had written 9 times. And 9 times, the letters had returned to her with a red stamp, saying that the man didn't exist. He placed the 9 envelopes to one side and reached into the lower compartment again. At the very back, standing upright, was a gray cardboard file he recognized immediately, because he had clipped it together with his own hands 2 nights earlier and placed it inside the black leather briefcase. The petition. The records Odessa had sent. The printed transcript of the recording. Elias opened it and counted. 4 pages were missing. 4 pages from the end, the section where Odessa had traced the money flowing into Preston's company through 3 intermediary entities. He sat on the carpet for a very long time with the open file resting on his lap, and in his mind, the entire night in the underground garage began running backward from the beginning. Slowly, 1 frame at a time, 3 vehicles blocking both ends, 6 masked men who hadn't spoken a word, shattered windows, broken taillights, a long dent running across the door, and the leather briefcase left untouched on the passenger seat. Within easy reach through the window that had been smashed open. No one had touched it because what they needed wasn't inside it. What they needed would deliver itself into the hands of the person who wanted it the very next morning, when a frightened Elias handed the entire file to the man he trusted most for safekeeping. He heard a key enter the lock in the corridor. Gideon Pryor stepped into the office holding a paper cup of coffee, and he froze at the threshold when he saw the safe standing open and the man seated on the floor among 9 envelopes. The cup of coffee lowered very slowly. Neither man spoke for a long time. "You came early," Gideon said. Elias stood. He brushed off his knees, arranged the 9 envelopes into a neat stack, placed them on the desk, then set the gray file on top. "Tell me," he said. His voice was very quiet. Gideon looked at the stack of papers on the desk. He put down his coffee, removed his coat, hung it on a hook, and performed every movement with great care, as though those actions were the only things keeping him on his feet. "I was your father's lawyer," he said, "for 30 years. I know. I was the one who advised him to plead guilty. You know that, don't you?" "I know. You told the entire family that if the case went to trial, his sentence would be 3 times as long." "That's right." Gideon sat in his own chair on the other side of the desk, and in that position, he looked much smaller. "There's one thing I didn't tell the family. I advised him to plead guilty, because if the case had gone to trial, the defense attorneys would have been forced to uncover the entire chain of communications leading up to the raid. All of it. Elias, including the calls that passed through this office." Elias didn't move. "How long?" 31 years, Gideon said. "The first payment came before you were born. At first it was only a consulting fee from a small real estate company. Then the company grew, changed its name twice, and when the son inherited it, he called it Holloway Meridian. I never did anything against this family. Hear that clearly. I simply did nothing against them." "And the 9 letters?" Gideon looked down at the desk. "If she had reached you, the 2 of you would have sat down and talked. And if you had talked, sooner or later, one question would have led back to this office." He raised his eyes, and they were red. "I'm 67 years old, Elias. My wife has been in a nursing home for 3 years. I have nothing left but this chair." Elias opened his coat, removed a thin envelope from the inner pocket, and placed it on the desk, sliding it to the other side. Gideon looked at it but didn't dare touch it. "What is this?" "A plane ticket," Elias said. "One way. Tomorrow morning at 9:15, and the address of a nursing home in Tucson. The climate there is good for the lungs. You'll find that your wife breathes more easily." He fastened his coat again. "Your accounts will be closed tonight. You're not to contact anyone in this organization again. If you board that plane, you can live out the rest of your life, and no one will bother you." Gideon swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" Elias had already reached the door. He stopped with one hand on the knob, but he didn't turn around. "Then I'll give this safe to someone else to open," he said, "and that person won't be me." Elias arrived at the Blue Hour Diner close to 4 o'clock in the morning, the hour when only truck drivers and people who couldn't sleep remained awake in the city, and he carried the 9 envelopes inside his coat. He hadn't opened a single one. Bernadette Kowalski was wiping down the counter when he pushed through the door, and she looked up at him for exactly 1 second before returning to her rag. "The girl is asleep upstairs," she said. "Please wake her for me." "No," She wrung the rag over a basin. "I've been feeding that girl 2 meals a day for the past 3 weeks, and I've counted exactly 4 times that she smiled. So I'm not waking her at 4 in the morning to listen to a man apologize." Elias placed the 9 envelopes on the counter. Bertie glanced down, saw the handwriting and the red stamps, and stood motionless for a long time. Then she removed her apron, walked into the kitchen, and Elias heard her searching through the storeroom. She returned carrying a cardboard box and placed it on the counter beside the stack of envelopes. Inside was an old answering machine, the kind that used a small cassette tape, its cream-colored plastic casing yellowed with age, its electrical cord coiled and secured with a rubber band. "This belonged to her family," Bertie said. "When they auctioned everything in the Ashford house, I went. Not to buy anything. I went because I knew the girl's father. He used to stop here for breakfast when I first opened the diner, before he became rich. They sold everything in lots. No one bid on the lot of old electronics because it was nothing but fax machines and broken telephones. I paid $11 and brought the entire lot home." She touched the lid of the machine. "I've kept this for 2 years. I meant to return it when I found the girl, because things from a home should go back to the people who lived there. Then she started working the night shift in my own diner, and I still didn't give it to her, because every time I thought about it, I told myself that girl was already carrying enough. What good would one more box of a dead man's belongings do her?" She looked at Elias. "Now I'm giving it back." The staircase behind the kitchen creaked. Maren stood halfway down, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her hair tangled, and she looked at the counter, at the 9 envelopes, then at the machine. She descended very slowly. "Where did this come from?" Bertie repeated exactly what she had just told Elias. Maren reached out and touched the yellowed plastic casing, but her hand trembled so badly that she had to pull it back. "This was kept in my father's study," she said. "He didn't use it to listen to messages. He used it to record things he needed to remember. He said he didn't trust notebooks because anyone could read a notebook." She plugged it in. The machine gave a click, and the tiny red light flashed twice before glowing steadily. There was a tape inside. Maren looked at Elias. He said nothing. She pressed the button. For the first few seconds, there was only the hiss of the tape turning, then the sound of a chair scraping across a wooden floor, followed by the voice of a weary man speaking slowly from some distance away, as though he were leaning back in his chair and talking to the ceiling. He began by stating the date, the habit of a man who kept accounts, and it was the exact afternoon before the gala at the Ashford Grand Ballroom. Then he began to speak. He said Holloway had come to the office that afternoon without an appointment, carrying 2 papers. He said the first was a complete copy of everything he had altered in the financial records over the previous 4 years, accurate down to every entry, and that he didn't know how that boy had obtained it. He said the second was a statement that had already been typed, leaving only the signature line blank, and its contents accused Salvatore Marchetti. He fell silent for a long time at that point. Only the hiss of the tape remained. Then he continued, and his voice broke in the middle of the sentence. He said Holloway had placed both papers on the desk and told him that if he didn't sign the second, the first would be in the prosecutor's hands on Monday morning, and he would lose everything, and his daughter would lose everything. But that, he said, wasn't what made him sign. What made him sign was what Holloway said next, that the Marchetti family had 2 men, the father and the son working behind a bar, and that if the matter couldn't be resolved cleanly on paper, it would be resolved another way, and with the other way, no one could choose who would be caught in it. Wendell Ashford said he had sat staring at the 2 papers for 4 hours. Then he signed the second one. He said he knew he had traded one father's freedom to preserve one son's life, and that he had no right to make that calculation on anyone else's behalf, but he had made it, and he would carry it to his grave. Then his voice changed. He said that evening he would call Maren into his study. He said he couldn't allow the city to see that the Ashford family still had any connection to the Marchettis, because if that connection remained, Holloway would understand that the statement hadn't been enough and would go looking for the other way. He said he would make his daughter sever the relationship, and sever it completely. And the final sentence on the tape, spoken very softly, almost in a whisper, was that he would tell her to make it hurt, to do it in front of everyone, to hurt that boy so deeply that he would never want to come looking for her again. Then came the sound of a button being pressed. The tape stopped. The machine clicked, and the red light went dark. Inside the Blue Hour diner at 4 o'clock in the morning, no one moved. Maren stood there with the wool blanket slipping from one shoulder. her face white. "He didn't tell me," she whispered. "He never told me. He only said there were people who would kill you if you remained beside me. He made me promise not to ask anything else," I thought. She covered her mouth with one hand. 3 weeks later, your father was arrested, and for 9 winters, I thought it was a coincidence. Elias remained exactly where he was. He stared at the yellowed plastic machine on the stainless steel counter, the object a diner owner had bought for $11 because no one else had cared enough to bid on it. And inside his mind, 9 winters were collapsing, one piece at a time. He thought of the man standing at the far end of the ballroom, staring at him, turning away, then looking back, and now he knew the name of the expression in that man's eyes, and it hadn't been contempt. He thought of the brownish-yellow folder Marin had described to him in a trembling voice over the past 10 minutes, the photograph of a strange car parked outside the Ashford gate, the 4 lines listing dates and times, the name crossed out so violently that the paper had torn. His father hadn't been investigating her. His father had been tracing the car. His father had known that someone was watching the family and had gone searching for who it was 3 months before that night, and he had found and crossed out the name with all the strength in his hand. Elias reached out and gripped the edge of the counter. 9 years, he said, his voice raw. For 9 years, I built all of it, so that one day you would have to look at me. He raised his head, and his eyes were red. I never asked you a single question, not one. I stood in the middle of that room and walked away, and for 9 winters, I never once asked you why. The next day, Elias carried everything to the federal building on Dearborn Plaza, the tape duplicated into 3 copies. The recording of the conversation in the Gold Coast apartment, the file Odessa had reconstructed on the 3 intermediary entities, and the brownish-yellow folder created by his father. He sat for nearly 2 hours in a small windowless conference room with a young prosecutor named Ellsworth, who took notes very quickly and asked questions in exactly the right places. And by the end of the meeting, Elias had begun to believe the matter would be resolved within a month. Then she stepped outside to make a telephone call. She returned 15 minutes later, and her face had changed. She didn't sit down again. She gathered the papers into a stack, pushed them toward him, and said that she was very sorry, that she wasn't authorized to explain, and that Mr. Marchetti should consult his private attorney. Elias looked at her. "Say that again. I'm not permitted to say anything more. Did you listen to that tape?" "I did," she said. Then she stood still for a moment and added one sentence she shouldn't have said, speaking very softly, that certain files, once submitted, were routed to precisely the desk no one wanted them to reach. Elias understood right there in that windowless room, and the first thing he felt wasn't anger, but a chill traveling down his spine. Odessa confirmed it that night with 3 calls to 3 different people. Preston Holloway had served as a cooperating source for a federal task force for years. Not once, but continuously. And the names he had surrendered were enough to build the careers of several people in the field. That was why he obtained contracts no one else could. That was why files concerning him kept opening and then closing. That was why he had dared to walk into a Gold Coast apartment in broad daylight, place documents on the table, and explain everything in the voice of a man reading a balance sheet. "There's one opening," Odessa said. They were seated in the back room of the Bridgeport restaurant beneath the olive wood crucifix and the photograph of 4 dead men. An agreement of that kind always contains one standard clause. It becomes automatically void if the cooperating party commits a new crime while the agreement remains in effect. Suspicion isn't enough. Neither is conjecture. It has to be evidence strong enough to present in court. "Does extortion count?" Elias asked. "Extortion counts, but Mr. Ashford's tape isn't enough, because it's the account of a dead man with no corroborating witness, and Holloway's attorney would tear it apart in 3 minutes. As for the recording from the apartment, he was so careful that he didn't say a single unlawful word. Listen to it again. He merely explained the terms of the trust and assessed his chances of winning in court. Not one threat." She closed her notebook. "So there's only one way. He has to say it himself. He has to state clearly what he did and how he used it to force someone to do something. We need a clean recording, a confirmed location, a confirmed time, and a living witness sitting in the room." Augie Marchetti had been seated at the head of the table all this time, his large hands folded together. He shifted in his chair. "Or," he said, "we don't need any of that." The room fell silent. "I know what you're saying," Elias said. "I'm not saying anything," Augie replied. "I'm only reminding you that this family once had a way of handling matters like this. and that way didn't require a judge, a recording, or 9 winters. My brother lay in a prison infirmary because of a man sitting in some air-conditioned room. I've waited 30 years. I won't wait any longer. Elias looked at his uncle for a long time. Then he shook his head. No. Elias. I said no, Uncle Augie. He placed both hands on the table. Yesterday I listened to a dead man tell me that he traded his freedom to preserve my life. He made that calculation, and he carried it to his grave. My father wrote one sentence to me in his final letter, a letter I didn't read until this week, telling me not to let anger choose my life for me. He looked around the table. For the past 9 winters, anger has chosen everything for me. It chose for me to walk away from school. It chose for me to knock on your door. It chose for me to sign 2 papers I couldn't be bothered to read, and 41 people had to work shifts with no room to breathe. Now it wants to choose again. He shook his head once more. If I let it choose this time, the boy about to be born will grow up in a city where his mother can't walk freely through the streets. I won't trade that for one night of satisfaction. Augie remained silent. Then he released a long breath through his nose and nodded once. Then someone has to lure him into speaking, Odessa said, and he'll never speak in front of you. The moment you appear, he shuts down. A chair scraped against the floor at the far end of the room. Maren Ashford rose. She had been sitting there throughout the meeting in the chair against the wall, one hand resting on her belly, 9 months pregnant. And until that moment, no one had asked her a single question. He'll speak in front of me, she said. Everyone turned. No, Elias said immediately. Listen to everything I have to say first. She walked slowly toward the table, one hand gripping the back of a chair. 3 times he stood in front of me, and all 3 times, he said more than he needed to. Because when he looks at me, he sees nothing to fear. He sees the girl he stripped of everything 9 winters ago. That's his only weakness, and it works for exactly one person in this room. You're 9 months pregnant. I know what I'm carrying inside me, Elias. I've been carrying him for 9 months. She placed one hand on the table. I have one condition. I choose where we meet, not him. He's accustomed to choosing the room, the time, even the chair where the other person sits. Not this time. Where do you intend to choose? Maren didn't answer immediately. She looked through the small window behind the kitchen toward the dark street outside, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly calm. There's exactly one room in this world where he can't maintain that composure, she said, and I know precisely where it is. The Ashford Grand Hotel had closed in the autumn after the bankruptcy and had never reopened. The main power had been disconnected, leaving only the emergency lighting system running on backup batteries, small bulbs mounted along the base of the walls, casting a pale blue glow that reached no higher than a person's waist. The crystal chandeliers had long since been lowered and placed in storage, leaving 3 bare iron hooks in the ceiling. The oak floor was covered with dust so thick that every footstep left a print, and along both walls, the mirrors reaching from floor to ceiling had been covered with white canvas tied at all 4 corners, so the ballroom no longer multiplied itself into countless other rooms. Now it was only a vast, dark, silent box. Maren had chosen the place for one very practical reason, one she had personally verified twice during the previous week. The building's security system was the original one installed during her grandfather's time, with copper wires running directly to the utility room in the basement and footage recorded onto a local hard drive. It wasn't connected to a network. There was no remote control software, and no way for someone sitting in an office elsewhere to shut it down or erase the footage with a telephone call. Anyone who wanted to interfere with it would have to enter the basement in person, open the cabinet, and pull the wires. Odessa had sent people to inspect the lines, replace the batteries, and reactivate all 11 cameras that afternoon. Preston arrived precisely on time. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, and Maren heard his footsteps stop at the threshold. She stood in the middle of the ballroom with one hand resting on her belly, in the exact place where she had risen from the banquet table 9 winters earlier. "Why here?" he asked. His voice sounded normal, but it echoed through the empty space and came back hollow. "Because I wanted to talk somewhere no one could hear us," she said. "You still want the signature, don't you?" He approached slowly, leaving a trail of footprints across the dust. When he came closer, the pale blue light rose from the base of the walls and struck his face from below, and Maren saw the thing on which she had gambled the entire plan. His jaw tightened. His eyes swept rapidly around the room, up toward the 3 iron hooks in the ceiling, then down to the white canvas covering the mirrors, and for 2 full seconds, He forgot why he had come. "You still remember this place," she said. "I have things to do, Marin. You stood 3 steps away from me, beside that column. Your hand was resting on the back of my chair." She spoke very slowly. "It's been 9 winters, and you still remember. I can see it in your face." Preston gave a dry laugh. "What are you trying to do? Revisit old sorrows?" "No. I'm going to ask you a question I never asked before." She raised her eyes to his. "What did my father sign that day?" He stood still. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Marin never looked away. "You brought 2 papers to his office that afternoon. You made him sit and stare at them for 4 hours. I want to know what was written on the second one." A very long silence followed. Then Preston Holloway did exactly what a man accustomed to winning for 20 years would do when someone mentioned the finest hand he had ever played in the very room where he had won it. He told her. He told her that the statement had been typed in advance, leaving only the signature line blank. He told her the first paper contained Wendell's financial records, and that he had paid an accountant $6,000 to obtain them. He told her the old man had sat there for 4 hours before finally picking up the pen, and he spoke of it with something almost like nostalgia. He told her he had needed the Marchettis removed from the riverfront, and the Ashfords paralyzed long enough for him to acquire the land, and that both tasks had cost him exactly 1 afternoon. Then he came to the final part. He said the current petition was only 1 more sheet of paper, that she had already signed 17 papers for him, and 1 more wouldn't kill anyone. He said that if she kept making trouble, he had ways to make her court file look worse within a week, that he had done it to 3 other people, and that none of them still lived in Chicago. High in one corner of the ballroom, a small black camera continued recording, its copper wire running along the molding and down to the basement. "Are you finished?" Marin asked. And it was her voice at that moment, that perfect calm, that warned him. Preston understood in half a second. He looked around the room again, differently this time, his eyes rising toward the corners of the ceiling, and the color drained from his face. He lunged. Marin stepped backward and caught her foot on the lowest step of the main staircase, and instead of reaching out to break her fall, she wrapped both arms around her belly. But she didn't fall. A hand had already reached around her back and pulled her away. Elias stepped from the darkness beneath the staircase, pushed her behind him, and took the full force of the impact against his ribs. He faltered for a moment, his breath knocked away, the sharp sound of his inhalation echoing through the empty room. Then he straightened. He didn't strike back. He merely stepped forward, forced Preston back 2 steps, then 3, and pinned him against the dust-covered oak floor with the full weight of his forearm across the man's chest. Dust rose around them in a pale cloud beneath the blue light. Preston struggled, then stopped. Elias clenched his free hand. He raised it, and he stopped there. His fist hung in the air, trembling, but it didn't come down. For 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 5 seconds. The only sounds in the ballroom were the breathing of the 2 men and the dust settling around them. Elias looked down into the face beneath him, then raised his eyes and surveyed the room, the white canvas covering every mirror, the 3 bare iron hooks in the ceiling, the empty place in the middle of the floor, where 9 winters earlier, a young man of 25 had stood frozen with a silver ring in his pocket. Slowly, his fist opened. "No," he said very softly, and it wasn't clear whom he was speaking to. "Not in this room." He loosened his forearm, rose, stepped back, and turned away. At that exact moment, white light swept through the ballroom, passing across the canvas-covered mirrors and climbing the ceiling. 1 beam, then 2, then 4. The headlights of federal vehicles shining through the broken panes in the row of front windows, encircling the room like the lights of a celebration to which no one had been invited. The storm swept into Chicago from the lake 2 days later, the kind of storm the radio called the worst in 15 years. And by midnight, the snow lay calf-deep across every street in the city. Marin went into labor when the buildings across the road could no longer be seen through the window of the upstairs room at the Blue Hour Diner. Hank drove her to Mercy General in a small truck fitted with tire chains, taking 50 minutes to cover a distance that normally required only 12. The baby was born before dawn. He was healthy, a good weight, and he cried so loudly that one of the nurses laughed, the strong, certain cry of a child with nothing in the world to fear. They cleaned him, wrapped him in a warm cotton blanket, and placed him against his mother's chest. Marin looked down, and in that moment she smiled. A smile Elias saw from the doorway, and would remember for the rest of his life. "Hello, my baby," she said. Then everything changed. Dr. Ruth Halloran was the first to recognize it. She said something brief to the nurse, her voice still calm, but the rhythm of the room changed at once. People began moving faster. Someone carried the baby into the adjoining room, and Marin called his name in a voice that was already quieter than before. Halloran went into the corridor to find Elias. "She needs a transfusion, and we need a surgical team," she said. "Her blood type is rare. Our supply was depleted the night before last because of the storm. The nearest reserve is at the blood center on the west side, and my on-call team is stranded across the city. The expressway is closed in both directions. The ambulances can't leave the parking lot. I've called 3 places, and all 3 gave me the same answer." "How long do we have?" "Not long." Elias stood motionless for exactly 3 seconds. Then he took out his phone. His first call was to Augie Marchetti. He spoke 7 sentences. The older man didn't ask a single question. He only said, "All right," then ended the call. Within the next 20 minutes, in the back room of the Bridgeport restaurant, beneath the olive wood crucifix, a 61-year-old man sat down with 2 telephones and a city map spread across the white tablecloth, and he began making calls. He called the construction union, which had 11 snowplows sitting idle in its yard because the city contract didn't require them to begin clearing until morning. He called the harbor, where there were container haulers so heavy that wherever they passed became a road. He called a man in the transportation department who had owed this family a favor for 14 years and had never once been reminded of it. He called 2 repair shop owners on the west side, a contractor named Doyle, and the manager of 3 underground parking garages along Michigan Avenue. He didn't threaten anyone. He simply gave his name, gave the hospital's address, and said that it had to happen tonight, and no one at the other end asked why. The first snowplow rolled out of the yard before Elias had returned to the corridor. Then the second. Then the third. They didn't travel together. They entered from 11 different points, along a single route Augie had drawn in red pencil across the map. The shortest path from the West Side Blood Center to the emergency entrance at Mercy General, and each plow cleared only its assigned section, before stopping sideways at both ends, so no one could mistakenly enter. The container haulers followed behind, rolling over the remaining snow and pressing it into a hard roadway. At the intersection of Ashland Avenue, a disabled bus had been blocking the street since that afternoon, and 2 mechanics arrived within 10 minutes, attached a cable, and pulled it to the curb. Hank Delaney drove the small truck in the middle of the convoy, his ribs still bandaged, while in the passenger seat, a young nurse held the refrigerated container in her lap, as though she were cradling a child. It was a night when anyone standing high above the city and looking down would have seen a long ribbon of light cutting through the white darkness from west to east, a road being opened by people whom no one had ever called good in all their lives. Inside the hospital, Elias returned to Dr. Halloran. "What about blood while we wait? We need someone with the same rare type here in the hospital. We've called everyone on our donor registry, but no one can get out of their home tonight." Elias rolled up his left sleeve. "Test me." She looked at him. "You aren't on our registry." "I am," he said, "just not under my name." He continued, his voice turning hoarse. "My father died after his lungs failed in a prison infirmary. After the funeral, I went to the rare blood donor bank and registered. I gave them his full name and his date of birth. I was 25, and I didn't know what else I could do for him. I thought that if his name remained somewhere in this city, it would mean he could still do something for someone. They've never called me." Halloran studied him for another moment, then turned to a nurse and rapidly gave a series of instructions. 15 minutes later, the result came back. He was a match. They placed a narrow cot beside Marin's bed, and Elias lay down, his sleeve rolled high, turning his head to the right so he could see her. Her eyes were partly open. "What are you doing?" she asked very softly. "Lie still. You don't owe me anything." "I know," he said. "This isn't about debt, Marin." Beyond the window, the wind struck the glass. On the west side of the city, the final snowplow had just finished clearing its section and pulled to the curb, its yellow roof light turning steadily in the falling snow, while the driver lowered his window and watched the convoy behind him pass. Hank Delaney shifted into high gear. The road ahead was straight, clear, and empty for the final 4 miles. A road an entire empire had dropped everything in its hands to open, solely to carry one refrigerated container to the right door. The storm broke before dawn, and when the sun rose over Lake Michigan, The first light of that day spread pale pink across the ice, neither harsh nor warm, only bright. 2 beds had been placed beside each other in the room on the 7th floor, one for Marin and one for Elias, less than an arm's length apart, and in the crib against the wall, a baby slept with both fists raised beside his ears. They were both awake. Neither spoke for a long time. "Are you in pain?" she asked. "No, liar. A little." He looked up at the ceiling. "The doctor says I have to stay here until this afternoon. In 30 years, no one has ever made me stay in bed." A snowplow moved along the street outside, very far away, sounding like someone dragging a chair across the floor below. "Marin." "Yes. I want to tell you something I've never told anyone." She turned her head on the pillow to look at him. "For the past 9 winters, I haven't built anything," he said. "I only put up an enormous sign so that one day you would walk past it and have to raise your head to look. Every building I bought, every contract I signed, every meeting where I sat at the head of the table, I thought about that night. I thought about the laughter in that room. I told myself, just wait, my time will come." He paused. "And it did. I found you in that alley, and I had everything I'd promised myself. You were lying at my feet, and I stood there with the entire city in my pocket." He turned to look at her. "And I felt nothing, Marin. Nothing at all. I stood there feeling so empty that it frightened me." She said nothing. "I proved that I could make people fear me," he continued. "I managed that. I became very good at it. But I never proved that I was worth having anyone stay. 9 winters, and not one person. My mother stayed because she's my mother. That doesn't count." He was silent for a while. "Last night, I lay here listening to the snowplows outside, and I realized that everything I had gathered was useful for exactly one thing: opening a road 4 miles long. If that's all the entire empire was worth, then it's enough for me." Marin stared at the ceiling for a long time. "Do you know what I traded?" she asked. "Tell me." "I was 22. There was exactly one real thing in my life, and it was you. Everything else in my family was borrowed. The house was borrowed from the bank, the name was borrowed from my grandfather, and the friends were borrowed from my father. You were the only thing that was truly mine." Her voice remained perfectly calm. "My father called me into his study that afternoon. He didn't explain anything. He only said that there were people who would kill you if you remained beside me, and he made me promise not to ask another question. Then he told me what I had to do." She swallowed. "I practiced those words in the hotel restroom for 20 minutes before I walked out. I practiced until I could say them without trembling. Do you understand, Elias? I stood in front of a mirror and practiced how to hurt you." He closed his eyes. "I traded the only real thing I had," she said, "so you could keep breathing." A long silence followed. The baby stirred in the crib, made a small sound, then went back to sleep. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Are you truly asking me that?" "I am." "When could I have told you, Elias?" She turned fully toward him. "You walked out of the ballroom that night, and 3 weeks later, your father was arrested. If I had knocked on your door then, do you think your mother would have opened it for me?" Then I wrote 9 times. 1 letter every December, and all 9 came back to my house with a red stamp saying that the man didn't exist." She drew a breath. "Then I ended up in this hospital, pregnant and penniless. What do you think it would have sounded like if I had told you then? It would have sounded exactly like a desperate woman inventing a story to ask for money. Even Yondidlov thought that." "No. Yes, you would. You thought it for 4 months. You simply never said it aloud." Elias didn't argue. "Then let me ask you one question," Marin said. 9 winters. You had money, people, and power. If you wanted to know what anyone in this city was doing, all you had to do was pick up the telephone. You even found the basement where I folded towels." She looked directly into his eyes. "Why didn't you ask?" He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. There was nothing to say, and they both knew it. Outside the window, the sun had climbed a little higher, and the pink light across the ice was turning pale gold. Elias reached across the space between the 2 beds. He moved very slowly, as though afraid she would pull away, and placed his hand over hers, the cracked and calloused hand he had watched for 4 months, in a hospital corridor, on the walnut desk, across a cup of tea in the Gold Coast apartment, yet had never once dared to touch. She didn't pull away. The door opened slightly. Hank Delaney entered with his hat in his hands, and he didn't look at the 2 people in the beds. He looked down at the floor. He walked to the small table beside Elias's bed, reached into his left breast pocket, opened the button, removed something tiny, and placed it silently on the table. It was a tarnished silver ring. Then he stepped back, put on his hat, and left, closing the door behind him. Elias looked at the ring. He didn't reach for it. He remained still, his hand resting over hers, while the morning sunlight slowly crept across the table until it touched the tarnished metal and made it shine a little. Summer came early that year, and on a July afternoon, Millennium Park was filled with people. The Blue Hour Diner had reopened in the spring with a new sign hanging outside, though inside were still the same old red vinyl chairs, and Bernadette Kowalski still stood behind the counter, scolding a regular for ordering 1 cup of coffee and occupying a seat for 3 hours without buying anything else, only to refill his cup for the 4th time without charging him. The diner now stayed open until midnight instead of throughout the night, and the evening shift employees earned a higher hourly wage than anyone else working on that block. Marin didn't return to waiting tables. She ran a small foundation from a rented room on the 2nd floor of the same building, a foundation that paid maternity hospital bills and routine medical expenses for uninsured night shift workers, most of them women, most of them people the city passed every day without ever seeing. A small brass plaque engraved with the name Salvatore Marchetti was mounted on the wooden door. Odessa Vance was the person who volunteered to serve as the foundation's accountant, and during her first afternoon reviewing the books, she told Marin one brief thing and never mentioned it again, that for 3 months after the day she had brought the check to the Gold Coast apartment, every one of Marin's prenatal bills at Mercy General had continued to be paid in full from Odessa's personal account, and that she had told no one because she believed there were things people did without expecting to be thanked. Rosalind Marchetti came to the park by bus, alone, refusing to let anyone pick her up. She sat on a bench, adjusted the scarf around her neck, then held out both arms and cradled her grandson for the first time. She didn't cry. She merely bent very close, breathed in the scent of the baby's hair, then looked up and said that the boy had his grandfather's forehead. Milo was 4 months old, plump and content, and his favorite place was on an adult's shoulders. Elias lifted him onto his own shoulders, holding him securely with one hand, and they walked around the fountain, where more than a dozen children ran back and forth through the columns of water, shrieking with laughter whenever the spray caught them, their bare feet splashing across the sun-warmed stone. Milo laughed with them, the laughter without reason that belongs to a baby of 4 months, while Marin stood watching father and son beneath the sunlight, one hand shading her eyes. When they returned to the bench, Elias took an envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to her. Her name was written across it by hand. "What is this?" "The 10th letter," he said. "The first 9 are yours. This one is mine." He sat beside her. "It took me 4 months to write. I kept writing it again because every version felt insufficient. Then I realized it would never be enough, so I decided to send it anyway." Marin accepted the envelope with both hands but didn't open it immediately. Then Elias reached into his pocket once more and removed the tarnished silver ring, the piece of cheap metal a young man of 25 had once spent 6 months saving to buy. He didn't kneel. He didn't say a word. He merely took Milo's tiny hand, opened it, and placed the ring in the center of the baby's palm, and the child closed his fingers tightly around it, the way babies grasp everything they are given. Then Elias reached for his left wrist, removed the steel watch with the cracked face, studied it for a moment beneath the sunlight, and placed it inside the small wooden box he had carried with him since morning. Then he closed the lid. There are wounds we carry for many years, not because they are too deep, but because we have never dared to ask the one question that could heal them. 9 winters of one man's life and 9 winters of one woman's passed in misunderstanding. Not because anyone was cruel, but because they both believed they already knew enough. We build entire lives upon questions never spoken aloud, then call what we have built fate. And there is one more truth this story hopes to leave with you. The woman lying in that alley that night wore a uniform frayed at the seams, but a person's dignity has never resided in the clothes they wear to work, the money in their bank account, or the name printed on their business card. It lives in what they are willing to sacrifice for another person when no one is watching. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue listening to new stories together every day. How do you feel about the journey Elias and Marin traveled? And if you had been in their place, when would you have asked that question? Please leave a few words in the comments, because we genuinely want to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. We wish you and your family lasting health, happiness, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.